I'm Linda, 34 years old, and I thought I knew what family meant until the day my sister told me my 15-year-old daughter wasn't welcome at her wedding. My heart broke watching Diane pretend she didn't care when I had to explain why she was suddenly banned for being too young. At that moment, staring at my mature, responsible daughter who helps me with everything, I realized something had to change. The phone call that would tear our family apart was just the beginning. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever felt that fierce protective instinct for your child, and subscribe for more real-life stories about family boundaries and finding your strength. Because what my sister did next, and how I quietly responded months later, changed everything between us forever. Growing up in Colorado, Margaret and I seemed like the perfect sisters on the surface. But underneath, there was always this invisible scorecard that I never realized I was losing. Margaret, 3 years older than me, had always been the golden child. She sailed through business school while I worked double shifts at a diner to help pay her tuition, believing in her dreams of becoming a successful financial advisor. When she graduated summa cum laude and landed that high-paying job in Denver, our parents glowed with pride. Meanwhile, I became an elementary school teacher, married my high school sweetheart, and had Diane when I was 19. When my marriage fell apart 7 years later, Margaret was climbing the corporate ladder and dating Thomas, a wealthy businessman who owned several car dealerships across Colorado. I was learning how to be a single mother, stretching every dollar shopping at thrift stores, and making sure Diane never felt like she was missing out on anything important. Margaret seemed to have everything figured out. Her downtown Denver condo was featured in a local magazine. Her Instagram was filled with expensive dinners, weekend ski trips to Vail, and designer handbags. She threw elaborate parties where everyone talked about investments and vacation homes. Meanwhile, Diane and I were perfecting our homemade pizza recipe and having movie nights with microwave popcorn. But here's what I never questioned back then: I was always the one giving. When Margaret needed help moving into her new place, I spent my weekend loading boxes. When she wanted to impress Thomas's parents, I spent money I didn't have on the perfect hostess gift. When she complained about being stressed at work, I listened for hours, offering support and encouragement. When I was struggling with the divorce, working extra hours to make ends meet, and worried about providing for Diane, Margaret would listen for about 10 minutes before changing the subject to her latest promotion or Thomas's business success. Diane grew into the most incredible teenager. At 15, she was mature beyond her years, helping me organize our household, maintaining a 4.0 GPA, and working part-time at our neighbor's bakery on weekends. She never complained about our budget-friendly lifestyle or asked for expensive things. When other kids her age were causing their parents headaches, Diane was researching colleges with good scholarship programs and discussing her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Margaret's engagement announcement 6 months ago was a grand affair. She rented a private dining room at Denver's most exclusive restaurant, hired a photographer, and had custom menus printed with gold lettering. Thomas proposed with a ring that cost more than I made in 6 months. The guest list for that dinner included Thomas's business partners, Margaret's colleagues, and our parents. I felt out of place in my 3-year-old dress, but I was genuinely happy for my sister. As wedding planning began, I eagerly offered to help. I volunteered to make centerpieces, organize the bridal shower address invitations, anything to contribute. Margaret accepted my offers with the kind of smile that I now realize was more patronizing than grateful. She was planning a destination wedding at a luxury resort in Aspen with a guest list of 200 people. The budget was astronomical, with details like imported flowers, a 12-piece orchestra, and a reception dinner that cost more per plate than I spent on groceries in a month. I started noticing little comments Margaret would make about maintaining the right atmosphere and ensuring appropriate guests. When I suggested including some of our extended family members who lived on modest incomes, she wrinkled her nose and talked about keeping the guest list refined. When I mentioned how excited Diane was about the wedding, Margaret's response was lukewarm at best. The red flags were there, but I ignored them because I wanted to believe that family meant something deeper than social status. I wanted to believe that the sister I had sacrificed for, supported, and loved unconditionally would never make me choose between her and my daughter. I was about to learn how wrong I was. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in late April, 3 weeks before the wedding. I was grading papers at our kitchen table while Diane worked on her chemistry homework across from me. The spring air was perfect, windows open, and we were planning to plant tomatoes in our little garden that weekend. Life felt peaceful and good. Margaret's number appeared on my phone and I answered with genuine warmth. We exchanged pleasantries about the unseasonably warm weather, her latest client success, and my upcoming parent-teacher conferences. She asked about Diane's grades, and I proudly shared that she had been selected for the National Honor Society. Margaret's response was a distracted, "That's nice," before she shifted gears. "Actually, Linda, I need to talk to you about the wedding." Her tone changed, becoming more formal, like she was delivering a business presentation. "Thomas and I have made a decision about the guest list, and we've decided to make it an adults-only celebration." The words didn't immediately register. I laughed, thinking she was joking. "What do you mean, adults only? Diane's 15, not 5. She's more mature than half the adults I know." Margaret's voice became colder. "I know you think that, but we've really thought this through. It's going to be a very sophisticated evening with cocktails and dancing until late. We want our guests to be able to relax and enjoy themselves without worrying about supervising children." "But Margaret," I said, confusion creeping into my voice. "Diane doesn't need supervising. She's incredibly responsible. And what about Cousin Jennifer's kids? They're coming, right? I was thinking of our cousin's 8 and 10-year-old boys, who were notorious for their behavior issues at family gatherings." There was a pause that felt like an eternity. "Well, that's different. Jennifer's situation is different." Margaret's voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "This is about maturity levels and appropriate behavior. Thomas's family will be there, Linda. Important business associates. I need to make the right impression." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked across the table at Diane, who was concentrating on her homework, completely unaware that her aunt was talking about her like she was some kind of liability. This was my daughter, who had never caused a moment of embarrassment in her life, who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, who volunteered at the animal shelter, who had saved her babysitting money to buy me flowers on Mother's Day. "Margaret, I don't understand. What impression are you worried about Diane as family? She's your niece." My voice was shaking now, and Diane looked up from her textbook, sensing the tension. "Look, Linda, I know this is hard for you to hear, but you have to understand my position. Thomas's family is very traditional, very successful. They have certain expectations about these kinds of events. Having teenagers there just changes the whole dynamic. I'm sure you can find someone to watch Diane for the evening. Maybe that neighbor of yours who watches her sometimes." The casual dismissal in her voice, the way she talked about my daughter like she was a pet that needed boarding, ignited something fierce inside me. "Watch her, Margaret. She's 15 years old, not 5. And even if she were 5, she's family. She's been excited about this wedding for months." Margaret's tone became even more condescending. "I really think you're overreacting. It's just one evening. You can explain to her that it's a grown-up party. Kids understand these things. Besides, wouldn't you rather be able to enjoy yourself without worrying about whether she's having fun or feeling out of place?" "Out of place?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "She's your niece, Margaret. How could she possibly be out of place at her aunt's wedding?" "Linda, you're being dramatic. This is my wedding day, and I need it to be perfect. I need everything to go smoothly. Having a teenager there, even one as well-behaved as Diane, it's just not the vibe we're going for. I'm sure she'll understand." But I was beginning to understand something else entirely. This wasn't about Diane's age or maturity. This was about shame. Margaret was ashamed of me, of my life, of my daughter. In her mind, we didn't fit the image she wanted to project to Thomas's wealthy family and her successful friends. We were the poor relations, the reminder of where she came from before she climbed her way up to her current social circle. So let me get this straight. I said, my teacher voice coming out, the one I used when a student was trying to explain why they hadn't done their homework. Cousin Jennifer's badly behaved children are welcome because Jennifer has money and a husband, but my honor student daughter is banned because she might embarrass you in front of your in-laws. That's not what I said. Margaret's voice was sharp now. You're twisting my words. Jennifer's children are younger, it's different. And frankly, Linda, I don't appreciate your tone. I'm trying to have a reasonable conversation with you about my wedding. Reasonable? I looked at Diane, who had stopped even pretending to do homework and was watching me with worried eyes. There's nothing reasonable about excluding a 15-year-old girl from her aunt's wedding because she doesn't fit your social media aesthetic. Margaret's voice turned icy. You know what, Linda? This is exactly why I was hesitant to bring this up. I knew you'd make it all about you and your feelings instead of trying to understand my position. This is my wedding day. Mine and Thomas's. We get to decide who we want there. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Margaret alternating between guilt trips about family obligations and cold dismissals of my concerns. She suggested I should understand about maintaining standards, and that maybe this would be good for Diane to learn that not every event includes children. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking with rage and hurt. Diane had moved to sit beside me, her young face full of concern and growing understanding. She had heard enough to know she wasn't welcome at the wedding she'd been excited about for months. After Margaret hung up, I sat in our kitchen staring at the phone, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage, hurt, and disbelief. The evening light was fading outside our windows, and Diane had quietly closed her chemistry book, giving me her full attention with the kind of emotional intelligence that made me so proud to be her mother. "Mom," she said softly, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "I heard some of that conversation. I'm not invited to Aunt Margaret's wedding, am I?" The direct question asked, without drama or tears, broke my heart more than any tantrum could have. I looked at my daughter, this incredible young woman who faced disappointment with such grace, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in my chest. "Sweetheart, your aunt has decided to make the wedding adults only," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She thinks it would be more appropriate." Diane nodded slowly, processing this information with the same methodical approach she used for everything else. "But Cousin Jennifer's kids are still invited, right? I saw the cute outfits Jennifer posted on Facebook for them." I couldn't lie to her. "Yes, they are." The hurt flickered across Diane's face for just a moment before she composed herself. "So it's not really about age, is it? It's about something else." My daughter's perceptiveness never ceased to amaze me, even in moments like this, when I wish she could just be a naive teenager. "I think your aunt is worried about making a certain impression," I said carefully. Diane was quiet for a long moment, then she shrugged with a casualness I knew was forced. "It's okay, Mom. I didn't really want to go anyway. Those fancy parties are always boring, and I have that chemistry project due the Monday after the wedding. Maybe I can work on it instead." But I could see through her brave facade. I saw the way her shoulders sagged slightly, the way she avoided looking directly at me, the way she started gathering her homework with movements that were just a little too quick and too purposeful. Diane had been looking forward to this wedding for months. She had been researching appropriate dresses, talking about doing her hair in a special updo, excited about dancing and celebrating with family. I spent the rest of the evening going through the motions of our normal routine, helping Diane with her remaining homework, making dinner, watching our Tuesday night cooking show together. But my mind was spinning, replaying every word of that phone conversation, every dismissive comment Margaret had made about my daughter. Part of me wanted to call Margaret back and try to find a compromise. Maybe Diane could come to the ceremony, but skip the reception. Maybe she could leave early. Maybe there was some middle ground that would satisfy Margaret's obsession with appearances while not completely excluding my daughter. But as the evening went on, I realized that seeking a compromise would be accepting Margaret's premise that Diane was somehow less worthy, less welcome, less family than other people who would be there. It would be agreeing that my daughter needed to earn her place at a family celebration, instead of being included simply because she was loved. I thought about all the times over the years that I had accommodated Margaret's preferences, adjusted my plans to fit her schedule, stretched my budget to match her expectations. When she wanted me to be her maid of honor, I had agreed to pay for an expensive dress I couldn't afford. When she planned her bachelorette party at an exclusive spa, I had worked extra hours to cover the cost. When she registered for wedding gifts that cost more than my monthly car payment, I had pooled resources with our parents to buy something impressive enough. But this was different. This wasn't about money or inconvenience. This was about my daughter, and there was no amount of family harmony worth making Diane feel unwanted or lesser than. I waited until Diane was in bed and sat in our living room with a cup of tea staring at my phone. The house was quiet, except for the familiar sounds of our neighborhood settling in for the night. I thought about calling our parents, explaining the situation, asking for their perspective. But I already knew what they would say. They would encourage me to keep the peace and not make waves and think about what's best for the family. What was best for the family, I realized, was protecting the most vulnerable member of it. And in this situation, that was my daughter. I picked up my phone and called Margaret back. She answered on the second ring, her voice guarded. "Linda, I hope you've had time to think about our conversation and you're calling to be reasonable." "I have thought about it," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "And I've made my decision. If Diane isn't welcome at your wedding, then neither am I. We won't be attending." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was sharp with disbelief. "You're kidding, right? You're going to miss your own sister's wedding over this." "I'm not missing anything," I replied. "I'm choosing my daughter over an event where she's not wanted." Margaret's tone shifted to the manipulative sweetness she had perfected over the years. "Linda, honey, you're being so dramatic about this. Just get Mrs. Patterson from next door to watch Diane for the evening. Come to the wedding, have fun, dance, celebrate with your family. Diane will be fine." "Diane is my family," I said firmly. "If she's not welcome, then I'm not welcome." Margaret's voice hardened. "This is ridiculous, Linda. You're choosing to be oversensitive instead of understanding that I'm trying to have the wedding of my dreams. Do you know how much this is costing? Do you know how much planning has gone into making everything perfect?" "I understand perfectly," I said. "I understand that your perfect wedding doesn't include your niece, which tells me everything I need to know about your priorities." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Margaret alternating between fury and manipulation. She accused me of being jealous of her success, of trying to ruin her special day, of being selfish and unreasonable. She reminded me of all the sacrifices she claimed to have made for our family, conveniently forgetting all the sacrifices I had made for her over the years. When I finally hung up, I felt emotionally drained but oddly at peace. For the first time in my adult life, I had chosen my own family over Margaret's expectations. It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. The morning of Margaret's wedding dawned bright and beautiful, the kind of perfect Colorado spring day that made the mountains look like a postcard. I woke up with a strange mix of sadness and relief, knowing that I was missing what should have been a joyful family celebration, but also knowing that I had made the right choice. Diane was already awake when I got up, sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her laptop, working on that chemistry project she had mentioned. She looked up when I entered and gave me one of her gentle smiles. "Good morning, Mom. I thought maybe today we could do something special, just the two of us. What do you think about going to that new spa downtown? I've been saving my babysitting money, and I thought maybe we could both get manicures." The thoughtfulness of her suggestion, the way she was trying to take care of me on what she knew was a difficult day, brought tears to my eyes. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart." We spent the morning at the spa getting our nails done and talking about everything except the wedding. Diane told me about her plans for summer vacation, her thoughts about which colleges she wanted to visit, her latest volunteer project at the animal shelter. Being with her, seeing her intelligence and kindness and maturity, reinforced my certainty that Margaret was making a terrible mistake in excluding her. In the afternoon, we went to our favorite restaurant for an early dinner. The hostess seated us by a window where we could watch families walking by with their dogs, couples holding hands, teenagers laughing together. It was a reminder that life was happening all around us, that family came in many forms, and that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones sitting right across from you at a restaurant table. But even as Diane and I created our own perfect day, I couldn't completely ignore the social media updates flooding my phone. Margaret had given her photographer permission to post photos throughout the day, and my Facebook and Instagram feeds were filled with images from what was clearly a spectacular wedding. The venue was even more stunning than I had imagined, with white flowers everywhere and mountain views that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Margaret looked absolutely radiant in her designer gown, and Thomas was beaming beside her in his custom tuxedo. The guest list was exactly what Margaret had wanted: successful, well-dressed people who looked like they belonged in a luxury lifestyle blog. And prominently featured in the family photos were Cousin Jennifer's children, the 8 and 10-year-old boys who Margaret had insisted were different from Diane. They were dressed in matching suits and looked reasonably well behaved in the photos, though I noticed they were front and center in every family shot, clearly positioned as the acceptable children at this adults-only celebration. I watched Diane scrolling through the same photos on her own phone, and I saw the moment when she paused on a picture that particularly stung. It was a multi-generational family photo with our parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and their children. Everyone was there except Diane and me. The caption read, "Surrounded by love and family on the most perfect day." Diane set her phone down and looked at me with eyes that were sad but not bitter. Do you think she even notices we're not there? I wanted to lie and say, of course Margaret noticed, of course she was thinking about us, of course she regretted her decision. But Diane deserved honesty. I think your aunt is very focused on having the perfect day she planned, and she probably hasn't let herself think about what that perfection cost. As the evening progressed, the social media updates continued. Photos of the cocktail hour, the dinner, the dancing. Everything looked flawless and expensive, and exactly the kind of sophisticated celebration Margaret had envisioned. I found myself alternately hurt by our exclusion, and grateful that we weren't there performing in Margaret's perfect family tableau. The extended family reactions started trickling in through text messages and phone calls over the following days. Some relatives were supportive of my decision, understanding that a mother's loyalty belongs with her child. Aunt Ruth, my mother's sister, called to say she was proud of me for standing up for Diane, and that she had always thought Margaret was too concerned with appearances. But others were critical. My parents were disappointed that I had made a scene over what they saw as a minor issue. Several cousins suggested that I was being overly sensitive, and that I should have just found a babysitter for one evening. Uncle Robert, Margaret's godfather, called to lecture me about family obligations and the importance of supporting each other during major life events. The criticism stung, but it also revealed something important about our family dynamics. There were people who believed that keeping peace was more important than standing up for what was right, and there were people who thought Margaret's social climbing was more important than including a teenage girl in her aunt's wedding. These revelations were painful, but clarifying. Margaret's version of events spread through our family network like wildfire. According to her narrative, I was jealous of her success and had used the adults-only policy as an excuse to ruin her wedding day. She painted herself as the victim of my unreasonable demands and emotional manipulation. Some family members bought this story completely, while others seemed to sense there was more to the situation. The weeks following the wedding were marked by an uncomfortable family divide. Margaret and I stopped speaking entirely, and holidays and family gatherings became awkward negotiations about who would attend what. Diane handled the whole situation with remarkable grace, never once suggesting that I had made the wrong choice or that she wished I had just left her with a babysitter. If anything, our relationship grew stronger during this period. We had faced a crisis together and come through it united. Diane saw that I would choose her well-being over family approval, and I saw that she could handle disappointment and conflict with maturity beyond her years. We became partners in creating our own definition of family, one based on mutual respect and unconditional love, rather than social expectations and appearances. Summer passed quietly for Diane and me, marked by a strange sense of freedom I hadn't expected. Without the constant pressure of Margaret's expectations and the exhausting effort of maintaining a relationship where I was always giving more than I received, I found myself with energy to focus on other things. Diane thrived during those months. She worked at the bakery, saved money for college, and spent time with friends who appreciated her for exactly who she was. She started dating a sweet boy named Kevin from her chemistry class, a relationship built on shared interests in science and mutual respect. Watching her navigate her first serious relationship with such wisdom and self-assurance made me proud, and also made me realize how much she had grown from witnessing our family conflict. I began exploring my own interests and relationships in ways I hadn't in years. For the first time since my divorce, I felt ready to seriously date again. That's when I met David at a coffee shop near the school where I taught. He was a divorced father of 2 college-aged kids, working as a civil engineer, and he had the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing who he was and what he valued. What struck me most about David was how he responded when I told him about the wedding situation with Margaret. He didn't try to minimize my feelings or suggest that I should have handled things differently. Instead, he listened carefully and then said, "It sounds like you chose love over approval. That takes courage." David's perspective as an outsider helped me see our family dynamics more clearly. He pointed out patterns I had been too close to notice: how I always accommodated Margaret's schedule, but she never adjusted hers for me, how she expected expensive gifts but gave thoughtful but inexpensive ones in return, how she sought my emotional support during her difficulties but was rarely available when I needed the same. "It's not that she's a terrible person," David observed after I had shared some of our history, "but it sounds like she's been trained to believe that her needs and wants are more important than other people's, and you've been trained to accept that arrangement." His words helped me understand that the wedding situation wasn't really about one event or even about Diane specifically. It was about a lifetime of accepting less than I deserved, in my relationship with my sister, and my daughter's exclusion had finally pushed me past my breaking point. Fall arrived with Diane starting her junior year of high school and beginning to seriously research colleges. She was interested in veterinary programs and had the grades and test scores to aim high. As we visited campuses and met with guidance counselors, I was struck by how much more relaxed these conversations were without the undercurrent of family drama that had marked so much of our lives. Thanksgiving approached, and with it came the annual family gathering dilemma. Traditionally, Margaret hosted Thanksgiving dinner at her house, an elaborate affair with expensive decorations, catered food, and a guest list that included Thomas's business associates along with family members. The invitation arrived in our mailbox in early November, a formal card with gold lettering that made no mention of our months of silence or the wedding conflict. I stared at that invitation for a long time, remembering previous Thanksgivings where I had contributed dishes I couldn't afford, arrived early to help set up, and stayed late to help clean up while Margaret played hostess to her impressive guest list. I thought about Diane sitting at the children's table year after year, while Margaret's adult friends dominated conversation about stock portfolios and vacation homes. For the first time, I realized I didn't want to go. Not just because of the wedding situation, but because those gatherings had never really been about gratitude or family connection. They had been about Margaret showcasing her lifestyle and social status with the rest of us, playing supporting roles in her perfect family production. Diane and I decided to create our own Thanksgiving tradition that year. We invited David and his kids, who were home from college, and a few other friends who didn't have family nearby. We cooked together, played board games, took a walk in the mountains, and shared what we were genuinely grateful for. It was the most meaningful Thanksgiving I could remember. Margaret called that evening, her voice tight with disapproval. "I noticed you didn't come to dinner today. People were asking where you were." "We had our own celebration," I replied simply. "With who? That man you're dating?" Her tone suggested that my relationship with David was somehow inappropriate or threatening. "With people who care about us," I said, not taking the bait for an argument. The conversation was brief and cold, ending with Margaret's pointed comment that she hoped I would come to my senses soon and stop punishing the whole family for her wedding decisions. But I wasn't punishing anyone. I was finally learning the difference between being part of a family and being used by one. I was discovering what it felt like to prioritize relationships based on mutual care and respect, rather than obligation and guilt. As December approached, I found myself thinking about Christmas and the traditions that would need to change. For years, I had spent a significant portion of my modest income buying expensive gifts for Margaret Thomas and their extended social circle, while they gave me and Diane thoughtful but clearly less expensive presents in return. I had never questioned this imbalance, assuming that my financial situation meant I should give more generously to compensate for my lower social status. But this year, looking at my budget and thinking about my priorities, I decided to make a change that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. It was a quiet decision not made in anger or spite, but from a clear-eyed assessment of what kind of relationships I wanted to invest in going forward. December arrived with the first serious snowfall of the season, blanketing our neighborhood in the kind of pristine white that made everything look magical. Diane and I spent a Saturday morning decorating our house for Christmas hanging lights and setting up our small but beloved collection of ornaments, each one carrying memories of Christmases past. As we worked, I found myself thinking about the annual gift exchange that had become such a source of stress and financial strain over the years. I had always prided myself on giving thoughtful, generous gifts to Margaret's family, often spending weeks searching for the perfect presents and stretching my budget far beyond what was comfortable. Last Christmas, I had given Margaret a beautiful cashmere scarf from an expensive boutique, Thomas, a set of high-end grilling tools, and their 2 cats' luxury beds that cost more than I spent on Diane's entire Christmas wardrobe. In return, I received a generic gift card to a chain restaurant, and Diane got a book from Margaret's college reading list, clearly something Margaret had lying around, rather than a thoughtfully chosen present. I had never allowed myself to acknowledge this imbalance before telling myself that the joy of giving was what mattered, that financial differences meant expectations should be different. But sitting in my living room surrounded by decorations that Diane and I had chosen together, I realized that one-sided generosity wasn't really generosity at all. It was a transaction where I bought temporary approval and inclusion at the cost of my own financial stability and self-respect. "Mom," Diane said, looking up from where she was untangling a string of lights, "I've been thinking about Christmas gifts this year. What if instead of spending a lot of money on people who don't really appreciate it, we use that money to do something special for ourselves? Maybe we could take a weekend trip somewhere, or you could sign up for that photography class you've been wanting to take." Her suggestion was so perfectly timed and wise that I had to smile. My daughter had been watching our family dynamics with the same clear eyes I was finally developing, and she had reached the same conclusion about where our resources should go. "That sounds like a wonderful idea," I said. "What made you think of it?" Diane was quiet for a moment, carefully working on the tangled lights. "I guess I've been thinking about how much you always stress about buying the perfect gifts for Aunt Margaret and Uncle Thomas, and how they never seem that excited about what you give them anyway. Meanwhile, we could be investing in experiences together, or things that actually make you happy." That afternoon, I sat down with my laptop and began rethinking our entire approach to Christmas. Instead of the expensive gifts I usually bought for Margaret's family, I decided to send a beautiful Christmas card with a photo of Diane and me from our Thanksgiving hike. Instead of the elaborate gift wrap and expensive gift bags, I would focus on meaningful presents for the people who truly mattered in our lives. I bought David a book of Colorado photography that I knew he would appreciate, and his kids thoughtful but modestly priced gifts that reflected their interests. I splurged on a nice present for Diane guilt-free for the first time in years. I sent cards and small tokens to family members who had been supportive during the wedding situation. And I used the money I would have spent on Margaret's gifts to book Diane and me a weekend in a mountain cabin after Christmas, our first real vacation in years. The relief I felt making these decisions surprised me. I hadn't realized how much anxiety I carried every Christmas, worrying about whether my gifts were impressive enough, expensive enough, perfect enough to maintain my place in Margaret's social circle. Letting go of that pressure felt like taking off shoes that had been too tight for years. Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow and the kind of peaceful quiet that comes when you know you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Diane and I opened our presents, slowly savoring each moment, talking about our plans for the new year and our upcoming cabin weekend. David came over for Christmas brunch, bringing homemade cinnamon rolls and an easy warmth that had become an important part of our lives. It was mid-afternoon when my phone rang with Margaret's number. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was sharp with confusion and barely controlled anger. "Linda, I need to know what's going on. We opened all our Christmas presents this morning and there's nothing from you and Diane. Did you forget to send them, or is this some kind of statement?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. In all our years of family conflict, Margaret had rarely been so blunt about her expectations. Usually she wrapped her demands in guilt and manipulation, making me work to figure out what I had done wrong. This time she was asking directly about the gifts she felt entitled to receive. "I didn't forget anything," I replied calmly. "I decided to change our Christmas tradition this year." "Change it how?" Margaret's voice was rising, and I could hear Thomas in the background asking what was wrong. "I decided to focus our gift giving on people who reciprocate the same energy and thoughtfulness," I said, surprised by my own clarity. "I've been thinking about our exchanges over the years, and I realize they've become pretty one-sided." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold with disbelief. "Are you seriously telling me that you're not giving us Christmas gifts because you think we don't spend enough money on you?" "It's not about money," I said, though part of me wondered if it partially was. "It's about reciprocity and mutual care. I've spent years stretching my budget to buy expensive gifts for your family while you give us afterthoughts and gift cards. I'm not angry about it, but I'm not going to continue the pattern." "Afterthoughts." Margaret's voice cracked with indignation. "I put thought into every gift I give you. Just because I don't spend a fortune doesn't mean I don't care." "You're right," I acknowledged. "But it also doesn't mean I have to bankrupt myself trying to match your lifestyle expectations. I've decided to align my gift giving with relationships that feel balanced and mutual." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Margaret alternating between hurt feelings and accusations that I was being petty and vindictive. She reminded me of all the times she had been generous with her time and advice, conveniently forgetting that most of those conversations involved me listening to her problems while she offered little support in return. When I finally hung up, Diane looked at me with a mixture of pride and concern. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Lighter," I said, and I meant it. For the first time in my adult relationship with Margaret, I had spoken honestly about our dynamic without trying to soften my words or manage her feelings. I had stated my boundaries clearly and calmly without anger or bitterness. It was a small change, really. Just redirecting some gift money and having one honest conversation. But it felt like the beginning of something bigger, a new way of moving through the world where my needs and feelings mattered as much as everyone else's. New Year's Eve found Diane and me in our rented mountain cabin, playing board games by the fireplace and talking about our dreams for the coming year. The cabin was simple but cozy, with windows that looked out onto snow-covered pine trees and a silence that felt healing after months of family drama and conflict. "You know what I love about this?" Diane said, looking up from the Scrabble board where she was absolutely destroying me with her vocabulary. "It feels like we're building something new instead of just reacting to what other people want from us." Her insight struck me as profound. For so much of my adult life, I had been reactive, adjusting my behavior and decisions based on what would keep peace with Margaret, what would maintain family harmony, what would avoid confrontation. Even my divorce had been more about escaping an unhappy situation than actively choosing a better one. But this past year, starting with my decision to skip Margaret's wedding, had been about making proactive choices based on my own values and priorities. I was learning to ask myself what I wanted rather than just figuring out how to avoid disappointing other people. I think you're right, I told Diane. It feels like we're finally living our own lives instead of performing in someone else's story. January brought unexpected developments in our family situation. Aunt Ruth called with news that Margaret's marriage was showing serious strain. According to family gossip, Thomas had been pressuring Margaret to start a family while she was focused on advancing her career. Their holiday parties had become tense affairs, where they barely spoke to each other, and several relatives had noticed that Margaret seemed unhappy and isolated. "I'm not saying this to make you feel sorry for her," Ruth explained carefully, "but I thought you should know that her perfect life might not be as perfect as it looks from the outside." I felt a complicated mix of sadness and validation hearing this news. I wasn't glad that Margaret was struggling, but I was relieved to learn that her dismissive treatment of me and Diane hadn't been the result of genuine happiness and confidence. People who are secure in their relationships and satisfied with their lives don't usually feel the need to exclude family members from major celebrations. February brought more surprising news when several family members reached out to me directly instead of going through Margaret as they usually did. Cousin Jennifer called to ask if Diane wanted to join her boys for a spring break ski trip, acknowledging that she had never understood why Diane had been excluded from the wedding. Uncle Robert, who had criticized my decision not to attend, invited Diane and me to his upcoming birthday celebration, making a point of saying how much he had missed us at family gatherings. It seemed that my quiet stand had forced other family members to examine their own assumptions about our family dynamics. Some of them were beginning to see that Margaret's social climbing and exclusionary behavior had been harmful to family unity, and they were making efforts to maintain relationships with me and Diane independent of Margaret's approval. David and I grew closer during these months, building a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine enjoyment of each other's company. He treated Diane with the same consideration he showed me, never trying to replace her father, but simply being a positive adult presence in her life. When he met my parents during a brief visit in March, he understood immediately why I had struggled with family boundaries for so long. "They're lovely people," he told me afterward, "but they've clearly been trained to prioritize Margaret's comfort over everyone else's well-being. No wonder you spent years thinking that was normal." Spring brought the most surprising development of all when Margaret called me in April, almost a year after the wedding that had changed everything between us. Her voice was different, smaller somehow, less commanding than I remembered. "Linda, I know we haven't been speaking, but I wanted to reach out because I've been thinking about some things and I was hoping we could talk." I agreed to meet her for coffee at a neutral location, curious about what had prompted this outreach. When I saw her, I was shocked by how different she looked. The confident, polished woman who had excluded my daughter from her wedding had been replaced by someone who looked tired and uncertain. "I need to tell you that Thomas and I are getting divorced," she said without preamble. "He's been having an affair with his secretary for 6 months, and apparently I was the last person to know about it." I felt a wave of genuine sympathy for my sister, despite everything that had happened between us. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. That must be devastating." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "The thing is, when I found out, the first person I wanted to call was you. But then I remembered how things ended between us, and I realized I had burned that bridge." We talked for 2 hours that day, the longest genuine conversation we had had in years. Margaret acknowledged that she had been wrong to exclude Diane from the wedding, admitting that she had been so focused on impressing Thomas's family that she had lost sight of what really mattered. She talked about feeling isolated in her marriage, realizing that the social circle she had worked so hard to join was made up of people who had dropped her the moment her marriage began to fall apart. "I look back at that wedding, and it was everything I thought I wanted," she said quietly. "But none of those people are here for me now when I actually need support. Meanwhile, I pushed away the one person who had always been there for me no matter what." I appreciated her acknowledgement, but I also realized that our relationship could never go back to what it had been before. Too much had changed, and I had learned too much about my own boundaries and needs. Any relationship we rebuilt, would have to be different, more balanced, more honest about our respective needs and limitations. I'd like to try to rebuild our relationship, I told Margaret, but it would have to be different this time. I can't go back to being the person who always adjusts her life to accommodate your preferences. Margaret nodded, seeming to understand that this was the only way forward. I think I need to learn how to be a better sister, she said, and maybe a better aunt to Diane. I've missed so much of her growing up because I was focused on all the wrong things. As our conversation in that coffee shop wound down, I found myself looking at Margaret with new eyes. The sister I had always seen as having everything figured out was revealing herself to be as lost and uncertain as anyone else. Her perfect life had been a carefully constructed facade that crumbled the moment real challenges appeared. "There's something else I need to tell you," Margaret said, fidgeting with her coffee cup. "When Thomas and I were having problems, he started criticizing everything about me, including my family relationships. He said I was cold and selfish, that I treated you like a servant instead of a sister. At first I defended myself, but then I started thinking about all our interactions over the years." She paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "I realized he was right. I have treated you terribly, Linda. I've taken your generosity for granted, dismissed your feelings, and acted like my needs were more important than yours. The wedding thing was just the most obvious example of a pattern that had been going on for years." Hearing Margaret acknowledge these truths was both validating and painful. Part of me felt relieved that she finally understood how one-sided our relationship had become. But another part of me felt sad that it had taken her marriage falling apart for her to recognize what should have been obvious all along. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied carefully. "It means a lot to hear you acknowledge those patterns." Margaret looked directly at me for the first time since we had sat down. "I want to apologize to Diane, too. What I did to her was inexcusable. She's an incredible kid, and I let my own insecurities and social climbing make me treat her like she wasn't good enough for my precious wedding. The truth is, she's worth 10 of those people who were there." Over the following months, Margaret made genuine efforts to rebuild relationships with both Diane and me. She started small, sending thoughtful birthday cards and text messages, checking in on important events in our lives. When Diane won a regional science fair competition, Margaret sent flowers and a congratulatory note that showed she had actually paid attention to Diane's interests and achievements. The changes in Margaret were gradual but noticeable. Her divorce had forced her to confront the emptiness of the social climbing lifestyle she had worked so hard to achieve. She started therapy, began volunteering at a local animal shelter, and slowly rebuilt her sense of self around values that had nothing to do with status or wealth. But I remained cautious about how much I reopened myself to Margaret's influence in my life. The year of distance had shown me how much energy I had been spending on managing her expectations and emotions, energy that I was now investing in my own growth and happiness. I was willing to rebuild our relationship, but only within boundaries that protected the life Diane and I had created for ourselves. David and I got engaged that summer, a quiet proposal during a hiking trip that felt perfect for who we had become together. When I called to tell Margaret the news, her response was genuinely warm and supportive, focused on my happiness rather than the details of the ring or wedding plans. "I'm so happy for you, Linda," she said, and I could hear that she meant it. "David is a good man, and you deserve someone who sees how amazing you are." Diane started her senior year of high school that fall, already accepted to several excellent colleges with substantial scholarship offers. Watching her navigate applications and interviews with confidence and self-possession, I was struck by how much she had grown from witnessing our family crisis and its aftermath. She had learned lessons about boundaries, self-respect, and choosing relationships based on mutual care rather than obligation. "Mom," she said one evening as we reviewed her college acceptance letters, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for what happened with Aunt Margaret's wedding. I know it was hard for you, but it taught me that it's okay to walk away from people who don't value you, even if they're family." Her words reminded me that children are always watching and learning from how we handle difficult situations. by choosing to protect her dignity rather than keep family peace, I had modeled lessons about self-worth and healthy boundaries that would serve her well throughout her life. Christmas that year was different from any we had celebrated before. Margaret joined Diane, David, his kids, and me for a quiet celebration that focused on gratitude and connection, rather than expensive gifts and impressive presentations. She brought thoughtful personal gifts that showed she had been paying attention to our lives, and she spent time actually talking with Diane about her college plans and dreams. Watching Margaret interact with Diane that Christmas, I saw glimpses of the sister I remembered from our childhood before social anxiety and status consciousness had warped her priorities. She was funny and warm, asking genuine questions and listening to the answers. It gave me hope that our relationship could continue healing even if it would never return to its previous form. As I reflected on everything that had happened since that phone call 18 months earlier, I realized that Margaret's decision to exclude Diane from her wedding had been a painful gift in disguise. It had forced me to examine family dynamics I had accepted without question, to establish boundaries I had never thought I deserved, and to prioritize relationships based on mutual respect rather than guilt and obligation. The quiet change I had made that Christmas, redirecting my emotional and financial investment toward people who reciprocated my care, had rippled outward in ways I never could have predicted. It had strengthened my relationship with Diane, opened space for a healthy romantic partnership with David, and ultimately created conditions for a more honest relationship with Margaret. Standing in my kitchen on New Year's Eve, watching Diane help David prepare dinner while Margaret played with David's grandchildren who were visiting, I felt a deep sense of peace about the choices I had made. Sometimes protecting the people you love requires disappointing the people who don't appreciate them. Sometimes creating the family you need means stepping away from the family you inherited. The most important lesson I learned through all of this was that saying no to one thing means saying yes to something else. When I said no to a wedding where my daughter wasn't welcome, I said yes to a relationship built on unconditional love and mutual respect. When I said no to one-sided gift exchanges and emotional labor, I said yes to investments in people who valued what I had to offer. Family isn't just about blood relations or shared history. It's about showing up for each other, consistently celebrating each other's achievements genuinely, and protecting each other fiercely when protection is needed. Sometimes the people who do that best aren't the ones you were born to, but the ones you choose to build a life with. As I looked around that kitchen filled with people who had chosen to be there, not out of obligation, but out of love, I knew that every difficult conversation, every boundary I had set, every moment of standing up for what was right, had been worth it. Diane was thriving, preparing for a college experience that would open up unlimited possibilities. David had become a true partner who enhanced our lives without trying to control them. And Margaret was slowly learning how to be the sister and aunt we had always needed her to be. The quiet changes we make in our own lives often speak louder than any argument or confrontation ever could. By simply refusing to accept less than I deserved, I had created space for everyone in my life to step up to a higher standard. Some people, like Margaret, eventually rose to meet that standard. Others revealed that they weren't capable of the kind of relationship I needed, and that information was valuable too. Now, when people ask me for advice about dealing with difficult family situations, I tell them what I learned in those months of choosing my daughter over family approval. You teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses, even if that refusal causes temporary pain for everyone involved. The story of Margaret's wedding was really a story about learning to value myself and my daughter enough to demand better treatment. It was about discovering that keeping peace isn't the same as maintaining love, and that sometimes the people who claim to care about you most are the ones who need the clearest boundaries. If you're facing a similar situation where family members are asking you to compromise your values or abandon people you love, remember that you always have more choices than you think you do. You can say no to events where you're not truly welcome. You can redirect your energy toward relationships that appreciate what you bring to them. you can teach your children that their worth isn't determined by other people's acceptance or approval. Most importantly, you can trust that when you make decisions from a place of love and protection, rather than fear and obligation, you're modeling lessons that will serve the people you care about for the rest of their lives. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in dynamics that diminish you or the people you love. Have you ever had to choose between family peace and protecting someone you love? How did you handle a situation where you felt torn between loyalty and self-respect? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it resonated with your own experiences. Subscribe for more stories about finding strength in difficult family situations, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Share this with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to prioritize the people who truly value them, even when that choice comes with a cost. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the smallest changes in how we respond to others can create the biggest transformations in our lives. Wishing you the courage to make the choices that honor your worth and protect the people who matter most.